Fear, fear is the result of getting, um, how to say it, is getting caught in the middle. Um, Buddha says it's the result of ignorance, and the ignorance is that when you start out as an infant with an undifferentiated awareness, and then you are taught who you are, that that component, that structure, which we call ego, is a very fragile structure. It seems tough, but it's actually a very fragile structure, and it's a structure that is created of mind, of learned neural patterns, if you will, and it has on one side of it what Freud referred to as the id, or the impulse life, which the structure is designed to interface between the impulse life and the society to protect the society from the impulse life. And on the other hand, it is this fragile structure in the face of tremendous forces externally, which are parents and then social institutions and chaos and storms and nature, all of it. So when you didn't have a framework, when you didn't have a somebodyness, you are just part of the universe and there's no fear. I mean, a tree isn't frightened and it's not clear. I mean, even like in one of the discussions that Emmanuel had about what a mouse feels like when it's being eaten by a cat. The question is the mouse saying, oh my God, I'm being eaten by a cat? Or is it feeling warmth and moisture and shifts in energy? And is the squealing, do we project, we anthropomorphize and we say it's squealing because it's afraid? But to be afraid, one has to have a self concept. And when an organism is functioning instinctually in a scene, each change in the homeostasis, each change in the balance of the situation is just a new moment. It's just a new moment to which it responds. Um, it's very delicate to interpret things because we tend to interpret in terms of where we're sitting. And we've developed these structures. And if you can sense the way that works, just see on one side of you these extremely powerful impulses in you that you're afraid of. And on the other side, the tremendous forces outside that you're afraid of. And feeling yourself as a very fragile entity within that structure. And so that the root of the fear is the separateness. The root of the fear is the model one has of oneself. That's where the fear starts. Once that exists, then you process everything from inside or outside in terms of that model. And it keeps reinforcing the feeling of vulnerability because, in fact, there are externally incredibly powerful forces outside and inside. The transformative process of spiritual work is reawakening to the innocence of going behind that model that one had that cut oneself off, that made oneself a tiny little fragile somebody. And a lot of the power preoccupations that we end up having, and especially the power of trying to leave something behind in the face of death, is the feeling of our own fragility. And if you look at social structures, you see how much social institution is based upon the feeling of fragility of the human condition. So, how you deal with fear, because you say, I'm afraid of that person. I mean, you say, I'm afraid of being socially shamed. But when you are socially shamed, it hurts. And then here we still are. You're afraid of violence. And then if violence happens, sure, it's scary and painful. And then behind it, here we are. And I think you presented it right, that often the fear feeds upon itself and we're almost afraid of the fear, or the fear is the thing rather than what we're afraid of. We're just afraid. We're just afraid. We just feel very vulnerable. The, um, the The ways of dealing with it. See, in a therapeutics tradition, what you usually do is try to figure out what you're afraid of. Um, Another technique is this witness, which merely sits with the fear and tries to get it before it becomes so consuming that there's no space left. There's usually a little space left. The image I usually use is if you have a picture frame, you got a painting of a cloud, of a gray cloud against a blue sky, but you only had one picture frame and it was a little too small. So what you did was you bent the canvas around to frame it. But in doing so, you lost all the blue sky. So you ended up with just a framed gray, right? It fills the entire frame. So when you look around, you say, I'm afraid, or I'm depressed, or something. If you enlarged the frame so there was a little, even just a little bit of that kind of round thing of a cloud and a little blue space, you'd say, ah, a cloud, right? That's what the witness is. The witness is that tiny little blue over in the corner that leads you to say, ah, fear. I've talked about the woman calling me in the middle of the night many years ago. And she said, I've taken LSD and I'm going to commit suicide. And I'm going crazy. I've gone crazy. I'm going to commit suicide. She called me from California to New York State at 2 in the morning. So I got up and I said, yes, okay, you're going to commit suicide and you're crazy. And it's dawned on me. I said to her, look, you're obviously too mad to talk to. Could I speak to whoever it was that picked up the phone and dialed 7 numbers plus an area code to get me? Because whoever that is obviously got all their marbles, and I'd like to talk to that person. See? 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 And in a way, that's the witness of the rest of it. See? Like I'll dial him and tell him I'm mad. It's like, and in a way, that's the little blue sky, and that's what we have in us all the time. Often we get so frightened, we can't stop for a moment to notice, there's fear, because it's consumed us. So the art is to keep cultivating that witness, continuously cultivating it in all the opportunities you have, so that it is present more and more of the time. At first, it's there about 1% of the time, and all the rest of it's there 90%, 99% of the time. But over a while, it gets so that it's there almost 50% of the time. And then as you start to go into these things, here comes fear. Here comes depression again. And when you focus on the witness rather than on the fear, you see that there's a part of you that is not afraid, that's just noticing it. The noticer isn't judging it. It's not trying to change it. It's not even afraid. It's just noticing. Like somebody comes in and says, I'm depressed. I said, are you completely depressed? Yes, I'm completely depressed. You're absolutely sure you're completely depressed? Yes. At this moment, as you're telling me you're depressed, are you depressed? Well, no, I'm just telling you I'm depressed. That's the one right there. That's the one. So in a way, recognizing that there is a part of you that always exists that is not afraid. And in the deeper mystical sense or transformative or spiritual sense, there is indeed a part of you that is always not afraid, because there is a part of you that was never separate. And that part of you that was never separate, how could you be afraid? You are everything. What could you be afraid of? It's all it is transformation of energy. I recall once being, again, I'm sorry, so many psychedelic stories are coming out this week. It must be somebody I'm trying to really do it to. But I was in Mexico in the ocean for an all-night LSD session, and there was a very wild surf, and I realized that if I went forward into the surf, since I couldn't tell the difference between up and down, I probably would drown. And I stood there and feeling all these forces upon me. And then I realized, I got this experience of going of imagining going into the surf and being underwater, and then that feeling of drowning, and then shifting, and then a whole new balance in relation to nature. And then I'm a bit of floating something on the water, and everything changes. And then there's moments in other people's minds when they say, "Oh, Richard, remember him? He died in the ocean in Mexico." And there's all these little flickers, and then everything quiets down, and then there's a new balance in the universe. And it was just a little shift from that balance into that one. In one, I am this somebody doing something, and in the next, I am part of the ocean's stuff, like a piece of seaweed. And my consciousness has moved into some other plane. And it all was, once I got out of the anxiety about it, it was just a shift, a metamorphosis of balance. It's just like a tree falling and then rotting and then providing nurturance for everything else in the forest and going on. And the tree isn't upset about its change of state. And I began to see there's the process of death, of the just seeing transformation of energy. And the deepest fear, of course, is the death, which is the extinction of that fragile little thing that we created in the first place. Because once you get back into the mystical root being, your true self, it doesn't die because it wasn't born. It just is. So there's always a place that is not afraid, and that's what one works to find in oneself by that work on oneself. And that's different, because if you are afraid because of that vulnerability and you keep focusing on what you're afraid of, like I'm afraid of heights, or I'm afraid of violence in the streets, or I'm afraid of this, you will keep substituting one after another. As you get rid of one, there'll be a whole new one to play with. Because it isn't really, you just pick one and then focus on it, but that isn't really what it's about. It's the fear itself from where you're standing. It's not the object, it's the subject that's the dealing with.